Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you no longer need to impress anyone. No invisible audience, no performance, no pressure to appear profound, successful, interesting, evolving, just silence, and strangely relief. A deep exhale leaving your body for the first time in years, because most people are exhausted from carrying a version of themselves that was never fully real. A carefully arranged personality, a socially acceptable identity, a curated self assembled piece by piece for public consumption. And the tragedy is, they become servants to that image. Every decision filtered through performance. How will this look? What will people think? Will this make me seem valuable? Even solitude becomes theatrical. Even private moments become rehearsals for imaginary audiences. The ego never truly rests. It demands constant maintenance, constant proof, constant reassurance. And slowly, life transforms into a stage where authenticity feels dangerous. Especially now, in this strange digital civilization where existence itself feels public. Every thought documented, every experience displayed, every emotion converted into content. People no longer simply live, they broadcast, perform, package themselves into consumable identities. And beneath all of it exists a quiet terror, the fear of becoming invisible, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that if nobody is watching, maybe you are nobody at all, so people keep performing, even when exhausted, even when empty, even when the performance is quietly killing them inside. But there is another way to exist, a calmer way, a freer way, one that begins with a dangerous realization. You do not actually need to be important to be alive. You do not need to become legendary, or unforgettable, or admired by strangers. You do not need to constantly construct meaning through visibility. The river does not announce itself before flowing. The sky does not beg to be remembered before sunset. Existence itself never demanded performance. Only the ego did. And perhaps that is why some of the most peaceful people seem almost invisible to the world. Not absent, not defeated, simply unburdened. They stopped trying to become monuments. Stopped trying to turn every moment into evidence of worth. They no longer wake up asking, how do I matter today? Instead they ask, how do I experience today fully? That shift changes everything. Because once you stop viewing yourself as the main character in a grand cosmic drama, your failures lose their theatrical weight. Embarrassment softens, rejection softens, even disappointment softens. Why? Because the ego is what transforms ordinary pain into existential catastrophe. The ego says, this failure defines me. This humiliation ruins my story. This mistake lowers my value. But without that constant narrative, experiences simply become experiences. Temporary, whether passing through consciousness, nothing more. And there is profound peace in that. The peace of no longer needing every chapter of your life to prove something. No longer forcing yourself into significance. No longer carrying the unbearable burden of becoming exceptional enough to deserve existence. You begin to understand something ancient and quiet. The need to constantly become somebody is often what prevents people from ever truly living at all. Because they are too busy managing identity to experience reality directly. Too busy narrating life to feel it. Too busy protecting image to encounter truth. And maybe freedom begins precisely there. Not in becoming greater, but in becoming lighter. Less obsessed with being seen. Less consumed by self-construction. Less trapped inside the exhausting architecture of ego, until eventually you discover the strange beauty of being nobody, not worthless, not empty, just free from the endless obligation to perform importance, the exhaustion of your curated self. Most people are tired in a way sleep cannot fix, not physically, existentially. A quiet exhaustion sitting beneath every interaction, every notification, every conversation, every carefully chosen photograph, because maintaining a personality has become a full-time occupation, especially now. In 2026, people do not simply exist anymore. They manage themselves constantly. Your face becomes a profile, your thoughts become branding, your experiences become potential content. Even emotions become strategic. Even grief becomes aesthetic. And slowly the line between authentic existence and performed existence disappears completely. This creates an invisible cognitive burden few people fully recognize. Every moment now contains subconscious calculation. How am I being perceived? Does this make me look successful? Do I appear intelligent enough, interesting enough, attractive enough? The mind never fully rests. It remains trapped in surveillance mode, watching itself continuously, correcting itself continuously, editing itself continuously. That constant self-monitoring consumes enormous psychological energy. The nervous system was not designed to live inside permanent observation. Yet modern life quietly demands it. You wake up and immediately re-enter the theater. Messages, updates, algorithms, performances, comparison. A digital coliseum where millions compete silently for relevance. And the frightening part is this: most people no longer know where the performance ends. The curated self slowly replaces the living self. At first, the performance feels harmless, a polished version of reality, a few filtered moments, a slightly improved image. But over time, people become emotionally dependent on maintaining that image. The ego begins protecting the character more than the person. That is why criticism feels catastrophic now. Not because humans became weaker, because identity became public property. A comment online can feel like a threat to existence itself. A drop in attention can feel like disappearance. Because modern identity is increasingly constructed through visibility. And visibility is unstable, temporary, fragile. So people become addicted to maintenance, posting, updating, refreshing, monitoring reactions constantly. Not always because they are narcissistic, often because they are terrified. Terrified of irrelevance, terrified of silence, terrified of becoming invisible in a culture that treats visibility as proof of worth. This creates a strange emotional paradox. People are more connected than ever, yet more psychologically fragmented than ever. Because performance separates you from yourself slowly. You begin experiencing life from outside your own body. Even beautiful moments become opportunities for presentation. You stop asking, "What am I feeling?" and begin asking, "How will this appear?" That question quietly poisons presence. A sunset becomes content. Friendship becomes networking. Creativity becomes marketing. Even rest becomes performative. People document healing instead of healing. Document growth instead of growing. Document authenticity instead of living authentically. And underneath all this performance exists profound fatigue, because pretending to be a stable identity is exhausting. Human beings are fluid naturally, contradictory, evolving, messy, but the curated self demands consistency constantly. A recognizable image, a coherent brand, a fixed personality. So people begin suppressing parts of themselves that do not fit the narrative. Certain emotions hidden, certain thoughts hidden, certain desires hidden, until eventually they no longer feel whole internally, only assembled. And assembled people are always tired, because fragmentation requires maintenance. This fatigue appears physically too: mental overstimulation, emotional numbness, anxiety without clear cause, difficulty resting even in silence. Why? Because the ego never stops scanning for social positioning. Am I admired? Am I falling behind? Am I still relevant? The body carries this tension constantly, even in solitude, especially in solitude. That is why many people feel deeply uncomfortable alone now. Without external mirrors, the curated self weakens. And when the performance weakens, an unsettling question emerges quietly: who am I when nobody is watching? Most people avoid that question entirely, because they have spent years becoming visible without becoming known to themselves. So they return to distraction. More noise, more performance, more activity. Anything to avoid confronting the emptiness underneath the character. And perhaps the saddest part is this: the fear of being forgotten drives people into lives they barely experience directly. Constant documenting, constant proving, constant reaching outward for acknowledgement. as if existence only becomes real once witnessed by others. But the soul grows tired living that way, deeply tired, not because attention itself is evil, because permanent performance disconnects you from immediacy, from simple existence, from unobserved life. There is a certain peace humans once understood instinctively. Moments do not need witnesses to matter. A quiet walk still exists without documentation. A private thought still matters without publication. A meaningful life does not require constant evidence. But the modern ego struggles to accept this. It fears obscurity almost more than suffering itself. So people continue feeding the machine, continue curating, continue performing, even while secretly longing to disappear for a while, to stop explaining themselves, stop presenting themselves, stop maintaining the exhausting architecture of identity. And maybe that longing is not weakness. Maybe it is wisdom. Maybe some deeper part of you understands something the ego cannot. That life becomes infinitely lighter the moment you stop trying to turn yourself into a product for the world. The myth of your own importance. From the moment you are born, the world quietly teaches you to become somebody. Somebody memorable, somebody impressive, somebody significant enough to justify your existence. You are told to stand out, build a legacy, leave your mark, become unforgettable. And at first, this sounds inspiring, meaningful, almost noble. But hidden inside this obsession is a strange form of psychological suffering, because the pressure to become extraordinary slowly transforms life into a performance of importance. People stop asking what feels true and begin asking what will make me matter. That question becomes heavy over time, heavier than most people realize, because the ego interprets ordinary existence as failure. An ordinary life, ordinary love, ordinary peace, ordinary moments. The ego calls these things insufficient. It constantly whispers, you must become more visible, more admired, more exceptional. And so people spend decades climbing invisible ladders without ever asking who built them. They chase status, recognition, influence. Not always because they genuinely desire these things, but because insignificance terrifies them. The modern world amplifies this fear endlessly. Every platform rewards visibility. Every algorithm rewards attention. Every success story becomes another reminder that somebody else is being noticed while you remain unseen. And slowly people begin treating existence like a competition for relevance, as if human worth can be measured through reach, followers, legacy, cultural impact. But pause for a moment, step outside the noise completely. Look at reality honestly. The universe is unimaginably vast, ancient beyond comprehension. Entire civilizations disappeared into silence long before your name existed. Kings vanished, empires collapsed, geniuses forgotten. Millions of lives once filled with urgency, now reduced to dust and unremembered echoes. And one day you too will disappear. Quietly, completely. At first, this thought sounds terrifying. But there is another way to see it, a gentler way. What if your cosmic insignificance is not depressing, but liberating? What if the universe never demanded greatness from you in the first place, only presence? The ocean does not compete with the stars. Trees do not panic about legacy. Mountains do not fear being forgotten. Existence itself is not obsessed with importance. Only the human ego is. And perhaps the ego became obsessed because it fears mortality deeply. If you can become unforgettable, maybe death feels less absolute. If enough people remember your name, maybe existence feels secured somehow. But this endless pursuit creates suffering, because no amount of external recognition permanently satisfies the ego. Attention fades, accomplishments age, relevance shifts. The crowd always moves on eventually. And people spend their entire lives exhausting themselves trying to outrun that truth, trying to become permanent inside an impermanent world. That is why viewing yourself as the protagonist of a grand cosmic narrative becomes dangerous psychologically. Every setback feels dramatic. Every rejection feels existential. Every embarrassment feels catastrophic, because the ego interprets life as a story centered entirely around itself. my career, my success, my image, my significance. Everything filtered through self-reference constantly. But reality is far quieter than that. You are not the center of existence. Neither is anyone else. And strangely, accepting this softens suffering immensely. Because once you stop believing every moment must contribute to your personal legend, life becomes lighter. You no longer need to transform every experience into proof of greatness. You no longer need constant validation that your life is extraordinary enough. You begin appreciating existence directly instead of narrating it endlessly. A meal rain against a window, a conversation at night, the feeling of breathing deeply after exhaustion. Simple moments regain depth once the ego stops demanding significance from everything. This does not mean ambition becomes meaningless or creativity becomes pointless. It means your worth no longer depends on becoming unforgettable. You can create without needing immortality from it, love without turning love into identity, exist without constantly measuring your importance against strangers online. And this creates a profound emotional shift. You stop carrying the burden of being special. That burden exhausts people more than they realize, because trying to maintain uniqueness constantly creates isolation, performance, comparison, fear. But ordinary existence contains a quiet beauty the ego often overlooks completely. To wake up, to feel sunlight, to share time with another human being, to laugh sincerely, to sit in silence without needing to prove anything. These things are enough, not because they are grand, because they are real. And perhaps maturity begins the moment you realize life was never asking you to become a monument, only to become awake enough to experience it fully before it disappears. The ego wants to become eternal, but the soul often wants something simpler, to finally rest from the exhausting obligation of being important all the time. The radical freedom of anonymity there is a strange peace that arrives when you realize something simple. Most people are not thinking about you nearly as much as you fear. They are thinking about themselves, their own insecurities, their own deadlines, their own loneliness, their own unfinished conversations inside their heads. The crowd you fear disappointing is usually too distracted surviving its own internal noise to study your life closely. And once this truth settles into your body, something loosens. The pressure begins dissolving. You stop walking through life like a defendant on trial. You stop treating every mistake like public execution. You stop performing constantly for invisible judges who were never truly watching in the first place. This realization feels almost shocking initially, because the ego secretly believes it exists under permanent observation, that every awkward moment matters enormously. Every failure remains archived inside other people's memories forever. But reality is gentler than that. People forget, people move on. People return to themselves quickly, and hidden inside that fact is profound liberation. You are far freer than your ego allows you to believe. The fear of judgment traps millions inside carefully restricted lives. People do not wear certain clothes, do not speak honestly, do not pursue strange dreams, do not begin new things, do not fail publicly. All because they imagine an audience evaluating them constantly. But what happens when the audience disappears? What happens when you stop structuring your existence around imagined observation? Something beautiful begins emerging: curiosity, playfulness, presence. You begin exploring life instead of defending identity. This is the radical freedom of anonymity, not invisibility born from shame. Invisibility chosen intentionally. The quiet relief of no longer needing to announce yourself to the world every moment, no longer converting every experience into proof of significance, no longer asking strangers for permission to exist authentically. Anonymity allows experimentation. You can fail quietly, learn quietly, change quietly, become someone entirely different without needing to explain the transformation publicly. The ego hates this, because the ego survives through recognition, through narrative, through constant reinforcement from external mirrors. But outside those mirrors, something more honest appears. Your actual self, Not the curated one, not the strategic one, the unguarded one. And at first, this can feel uncomfortable, almost empty, because many people have spent years building identity entirely through external reaction. Likes, attention, validation, approval. Without those signals, they feel temporarily lost. But stay there long enough, stay inside anonymity long enough, and eventually another feeling emerges: relief. The relief of existing without constant interpretation. The relief of not needing to optimize your personality endlessly. The relief of silence. This silence changes perception itself. You begin noticing the world again, not as a stage but as reality. The sound of footsteps at night, the texture of cold air, the rhythm of strangers passing by without knowing your name, the small sacred feeling of drinking coffee alone while nobody expects anything from you. These moments become strangely alive once the ego stops narrating them constantly. And perhaps this is what many people secretly crave now. Not more visibility, less performance. A temporary disappearance from the exhausting machinery of self-construction. Because visibility creates tension, but anonymity creates space. Space to observe, space to think, space to become, without pressure, without branding, without needing immediate coherence. This is why some of the wisest people gradually withdraw from unnecessary exposure. Not because they hate humanity, because they understand attention can become spiritually loud. Too many voices entering your mind constantly. Too many expectations shaping your behavior invisibly. Too many opportunities to become fragmented through performance. So they step back, quietly, not dramatically. And inside that withdrawal, they rediscover something ancient. A human being does not need to be witnessed constantly to be real. A flower blooming deep inside a forest still blooms fully without applause. The moon does not announce itself before rising. Existence itself performs no marketing. Only the ego believes everything valuable must remain visible continuously. That is why anonymity feels almost sacred now. In a civilization addicted to exposure, privacy becomes medicine. Silence becomes rebellion. Disappearing becomes healing. And perhaps the most surprising part is this: once you stop obsessing over how you appear, you finally begin encountering life directly. Food tastes richer, conversations feel deeper, art feels quieter, time slows down slightly, because attention returns to reality instead of self-monitoring constantly. The ego filters every experience through self-reference. How do I look? How am I being perceived? What does this say about me? But anonymity dissolves those filters slowly. You stop orbiting yourself endlessly, and the world opens wider because of it. This does not mean abandoning all ambition or hiding from life. It means no longer needing every moment to reinforce your identity, no longer carrying yourself like a public relations project, no longer exhausting your spirit maintaining a fictional version of stability. Instead, you become lighter, less defensive, less performative, more present, and eventually you realize something profound. The absence of an audience is not loneliness. Sometimes it is freedom, transforming failure into infinite space. Most people think losing destroys them. Losing status, losing success, losing relationships, losing identity. But sometimes the collapse is not destruction. Sometimes it is excavation, because failure has a brutal way of removing everything false. The performance weakens, the ego fractures. The carefully constructed image no longer holds together, and for a while this feels unbearable, humiliating, empty, like your life has fallen apart in public, but hidden inside collapse is something strangely pure: silence. No more pretending, no more maintaining appearances, no more exhausting yourself protecting an identity already dying internally. There is a ruthless clarity that only arrives when you have nothing left to defend. And most people never experience this clarity because they spend their entire lives protecting status, protecting reputation, protecting image, protecting the fragile architecture of who they think they are supposed to be. That protection consumes enormous energy. The successful person fears losing success. The admired person fears irrelevance. The intelligent person fears appearing foolish. The strong person fears vulnerability. So they live cautiously, defensively, always calculating, always preserving. But once failure strips those protections away, something unexpected happens. You begin breathing differently. Not immediately. At first there is grief, shock, disorientation, because ego death feels like actual death psychologically. The identity says, if this version of me collapses, what remains? And for a moment, you truly do not know. But that uncertainty contains possibility, infinite possibility. Because once the false structure breaks, you are no longer trapped maintaining it. A person with nothing to prove moves differently through the world. Calmer, sharper, less afraid, because fear often comes from preservation. Preserving image, preserving expectations, preserving superiority. But what happens when there is no image left to protect? Freedom. Terrifying freedom, but freedom nonetheless. This is why some people emerge from catastrophic failure strangely transformed. Not weaker, more real, more honest, more grounded, because collapse stripped away illusion. And illusion is heavy. Heavier than most people realize. It takes tremendous energy to pretend constantly. To appear successful while secretly exhausted. To appear confident while quietly terrified. To appear certain while internally fragmented. Failure interrupts the performance, forces confrontation, and confrontation creates clarity. Suddenly you see who truly cared about you. Suddenly you see which ambitions were genuine and which were ego decoration. Suddenly, you see how much of your life was built around maintaining perception rather than experiencing reality. That clarity hurts, but it also liberates, because now your choices become cleaner. You stop chasing things purely for validation. Stop speaking only to impress. Stop forcing yourself into narratives that no longer fit your soul. The ego calls this collapse, but perhaps it is simplification, a shedding. Like winter stripping trees bare so they can stop wasting energy holding dead leaves. And maybe this is why some people secretly feel relief after losing everything. Not happiness, relief. The exhausting performance finally ends. No more pretending to enjoy the life they secretly hated. No more carrying impossible expectations. No more maintaining an identity built entirely around external approval. Rock bottom contains strange silence, and silence reveals truth mercilessly. You discover what remains when applause disappears, when status disappears, when certainty disappears, and what remains is often far more durable than the ego imagined. Awareness, presence, adaptability, humility, the ability to rebuild honestly instead of theatrically. This creates an enormous advantage psychologically. Because a person no longer terrified of failure becomes incredibly difficult to control. Most people are manipulated through fear of loss, fear of embarrassment, fear of rejection, fear of appearing insignificant. But once you survive collapse, those fears lose some of their power. You realize the ego exaggerated catastrophe constantly. You realize humiliation did not end your existence. You realize being seen imperfectly did not destroy reality. And suddenly, your creativity changes too. Because creativity suffocates under excessive self-protection. People censor themselves constantly trying to preserve reputation, trying to appear intelligent, trying to avoid criticism. But once the need for perfection weakens, expression becomes freer. Ideas become sharper. Risk becomes tolerable. This is the hidden power of having nothing to prove. Your energy stops leaking into image maintenance and returns to direct engagement with life itself. The person obsessed with appearing successful is psychologically fragile, but the person already comfortable being nobody, dangerously free, because they can experiment without terror, fail without collapse, adapt without ego resistance, and in a strange way, that freedom becomes a competitive advantage, not because they are trying to dominate others, because they are no longer paralyzed by self-consciousness. Most people are trapped inside psychological armor, protecting themselves constantly, but armor is heavy, and eventually, the unarmored person moves faster through life than the protected one ever could. That is the paradox failure reveals. Losing the false self creates space for something infinitely more alive to emerge. Not a perfected identity, not a grander performance, just a quieter human being finally free enough to exist honestly. The quiet power of being nothing. There is a form of strength that does not announce itself. It does not compete for attention. It does not need admiration. It does not enter every room trying to be remembered. It simply exists, calmly, fully, without performance. This is the quiet power of being nothing, not nothing as emptiness, nothing as freedom. Freedom from the exhausting need to constantly become somebody. Most people misunderstand this completely. They think being nobody means failure, defeat, lack of ambition. But there is a profound difference between disappearing because you lost yourself and stepping away from the performance because you finally found yourself. One is collapse, the other is liberation. The liberated person no longer builds identity from external reaction, no longer checks their worth against attention, no longer treats life like an endless audition. And because of this, their nervous system becomes quieter, lighter, more stable. They stop carrying the invisible weight of perpetual self-construction. That weight crushes millions silently. The pressure to appear successful, relevant, interesting, emotionally evolved, productive, unique. The modern world constantly asks, who are you becoming? But very rarely asks, can you simply be here fully? So people spend years running toward improved versions of themselves while abandoning the present moment entirely. Always becoming, rarely arriving. The quiet person steps outside this race internally, not through laziness, through clarity. They understand something simple: no perfected identity will finally grant permanent peace. The ego always creates another standard, another mountain, another insecurity, another performance. So instead of endlessly feeding the machine, they loosen their attachment to it. Gently, gradually, they stop trying to turn every experience into proof of value. A walk becomes a walk again. Not content, not optimization, not branding, just footsteps and breathing. Conversation becomes conversation again, not networking, not positioning, not subtle self-advertisement. Just two human beings meeting honestly for a moment. Even silence changes. Silence no longer feels like absence. It becomes space. A return, a kind of inner unclenching. This state cannot fully emerge while constantly connected to noise. So practical liberation matters. Small, intentional disappearances. Moments where you stop performing entirely. No posting, no explaining. No broadcasting your growth while it is still fragile. Protect parts of your life from public consumption. Not everything sacred needs witnesses, especially now, when visibility has become addictive culturally. Learn to leave some moments untouched, unread by algorithms, unshaped by reaction. Drink coffee without photographing it. Watch the rain without narrating it internally. Create something without immediately wondering how it will be received. Walk somewhere without needing evidence afterward. These small acts retrain the nervous system slowly. They remind you that existence still happens beyond performance. Another important step: become comfortable disappointing the version of yourself built entirely for approval. That version may panic initially. It may fear irrelevance, fear obscurity, fear stillness. Let it panic. Do not obey it automatically, because the ego survives through urgency, through constant movement, constant proving. But many truths only appear when urgency dissolves. And perhaps the deepest practice is this: stop interpreting every life event through self-reference. Not everything is about you. Not every silence means rejection. Not every setback is cosmic punishment. Not every moment requires meaning. The universe is not constantly evaluating your significance. Most of existence simply unfolds, quietly, indifferently, beautifully. Once this realization settles deeply, you become softer psychologically, less defensive, less fragile. You stop demanding constant confirmation that your life matters enough. And ironically, that is often when life begins feeling most vivid, because presence returns. You notice texture again, wind moving through trees, the sound of distant traffic at night, the strange, sacred feeling of existing briefly inside an ancient universe without needing to conquer it. This does not make you passive or detached from ambition completely. It simply changes the source of your movement. You create because creating feels alive, not because you need immortality. You love because connection matters, not because you need validation. You work because engagement with reality matters, not because your worth depends on productivity. This creates immense psychological resilience, because your identity no longer collapses every time external approval fluctuates. Praise comes, praise leaves. Success comes, success leaves. Attention comes, attention leaves, and still you remain present, uncluttered, whole. That is the quiet power of being nothing, the freedom of no longer carrying yourself like a project that constantly needs improvement before it deserves peace. And perhaps that is the final invitation hidden beneath all of this. Trade the unbearable heaviness of maintaining a curated existence for the lightness of simply being here while life passes through you. No grand performance, no desperate self-construction, just awareness, breathing, presence, and the strange, beautiful relief of realizing you were never required to become extraordinary in order to finally feel alive.